All right, welcome everyone to our explanation of the ADAS model. So to start off with, we have our basic ADAS model where we have our long run aggregate supply curve, our short run aggregate supply curve, and our aggregate demand supply curve. And the way it works is you have inflation on the y-axis and you have real GDP growth rate on the x-axis. And so these two added together will give you your total spending. And so we have a couple different kinds of shocks that are going to happen, and we're going to see how that affects each one of these lines. And so the first one, we have a negative supply shock, bad weather. Those are meant to be the rain clouds, not the greatest artist. So as you can see, a negative supply shock is going to affect our long run aggregate supply curve. And so right here, and our long run aggregate supply curve is essentially the Solow model, which is the maximum amount of output that a country is able to produce, because that's all the capital it has. And so a negative supply shock is going to have to do with its capitals. For example, bad weather. Let's use the example of a apple tree. You're not going to be able to, if there's bad weather, the apple is not going to be able to give off as many apples, and so you're going to have less capital to work with, because in this example apples are capital. And so sadly our long run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, and we know our short run, this guy right here, short run aggregate supply curve, moves with it. And so they're going to move along the aggregate demand curve, and we're going to end right about there. And you can see that our inflation has risen from we started here about 5%, and it's jumped up to about 8%. And our real GDP growth rate has fallen from about 5% to about 3%. And so overall inflation goes up and real GDP growth rate drops when our long run aggregate supply curve has a negative shock. And in this example, it's bad weather. All right, next we have a positive supply shock. That's always good. And so here we go again. We have our basic ADAS model with our equilibrium at about 5% each. And lucky we have some good weather, which is a positive supply shock to the ADAS, to the AD long run aggregate supply curve. And that shifts the curve to the right. And we know that the short run aggregate supply curves moves with it as well, and they're going to intersect on the aggregate demand curve as well. And so here we can see that our intersection or equilibrium point is going to be about at 8 and 2%. So we can see that inflation has dropped luckily from about 5% to about 2%, and our real GDP growth rate is 8%, and it's jumped from 5% to 8%. So that's overall pretty good for the economy, because inflation goes down and real GDP growth rate increases. So that's really best case scenario. And again, that is with a positive supply shock, such as good weather. And again, we'll use the example of a apple tree. If there's good weather, hopefully the apple tree, we're expecting the apple tree to produce more apples, and so they're able to sell more, and you have more capitals. And again, the long run aggregate supply curve is just a function of all your capitals. And so the more capitals they have, the further along is going to be on the GDP, real GDP growth rate. And now we're going to take a break from our long run aggregate supply curve, and we're going to jump over to our aggregate demand curve. And so here we're going to go over a negative shock. And so here we have our basic ADAS model with inflation on the y-axis, real GDP growth rate on the x-axis, and we have an equilibrium point of about 5 again. And sadly, some things happen and our taxes go up, which means when our taxes go up, we have less money to spend. And we know if we have less money to spend, that means that our demand is going to go down, and all of the demands added up is our aggregate demand, and the aggregate demand is going to fall. And so here we have our ADAS model for when there is a negative supply shock. Here we can see the long run, it's still right there, hasn't moved. Short run hasn't moved, but it's intersecting at different points. So we can see here's the original aggregate demand curve from up here, and we can see that it's shifted to the left. And so the one good thing is that we're gonna have a lower inflation rate, but it doesn't quite equal out, because our real GDP growth rate is going to drop as well. And so even though inflation is a little bit lower, we're going to get more, the GDP growth rate is going to drop even more. And so in the short run, it's out here, and eventually you're either going to have to lower prices or you're going to have to lay some people off. So if you want to lower prices, you're going to fall back here. Or if you keep them the same, you're just going to be not producing as many, and you're going to have a recession problem. And so here we see that our inflation goes down, as well as our real GDP growth rate, and we're going to have recession/unemployment because not all their capitals are going to be employed. And so yeah, here you have a short run problem and you have a long run aggregate. You have a long run problem as well. And so let's go onto the better side of positive demand shock. So here again, we have our ADAS model where that's a little low, but we're going to pretend that intersects at 5% or equilibrium at 5% each. And good news, taxes went down, which means we have more money to spend, and we're gonna be able to spend more. But the thing is, the reason why this graph is a little bit more complicated is because the government doesn't always want to increase the aggregate demand curve, because if it does too much, then you're going to have an inflation problem because you've overstimulated the economy. And so for our first example, we're going to pretend that we're already in recession and the government wants to stimulate the aggregate demand to bring it back to equilibrium, right where it should be. And so our first example is we're in a bit of recession, we have some unemployment, and so we're going to stimulate the economy. And so if you use this as our original, we can see that it's about a 3% and about 4%, we'll call it. And then as we stimulate the aggregate demand, you're going to find yourself about 5%. So inflation's going to go up, but your GDP growth rate is going to go up as well. And so in the short run, you're going to be perfect. You're going to be right here, right where you want to be. In the long run, you're going to be in the same spot. And then, but if you overstimulate the economy, say that we're doing well, we're already in a regular time, we're already in equilibrium, and the government overstimulates the economy because of lower personal taxes, then we're going to come out here, the aggregate demand, same thing's going to happen. You're going to have higher inflation and higher real GDP growth rate. And the short run is going to be great, but eventually you can't sustain that forever. And so it's going to drop back down. And so what you're going to have is you're going to have an inflation problem, because you can't sustain you're out here performing at 110%, and you can't perform at 110% forever. And so eventually you're going to fall back to really what's realistic you can produce, and you're going to be stuck with higher inflation than regular. You're going to be about, well, for this example, call it 6% inflation, and you're going to be right back where you started at 5% real growth. And so that's why you don't want to overstimulate the economy, but you also don't want to have an economy that's understimulated, because then you're going to have a recession problem. And if you have a recession/unemployment problem, and if you overstimulate, you're going to have an inflation problem in the long run. And so yeah, that's our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and hope you learned a little.